10, 9, 8. Engines ignite. Metal shudders under the strain of fire. The rocket surges upward, a spear of flame ripping into the night. For a moment, everything works as planned. Telemetry streams to mission control. Data ticks upward. Altitude, thrust, burn time. The vehicle arcs skyward on a perfect trajectory. And then, silence. No explosion. No debris cloud. The rocket doesn't fall back to Earth. It simply disappears. Gone from radar. Gone from telemetry. Gone from every system designed to track its every move. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Redundancy upon redundancy had been built into the mission. Every instrument, every frequency, every angle of observation accounted for. Yet, in the cold dark of the upper atmosphere, the rocket slipped away. And months later, something came back. An object tore across the sky. Its re-entry corridor matched the vanished rocket's trajectory with uncanny precision. But when recovery teams got their first look, dread settled in. This wasn't the same vehicle. It bore scars that didn't fit, materials that shouldn't exist, a history that didn't belong. The rocket that had vanished into space had returned as something else. It began like so many other launches. A classified mission, a vehicle built to place a satellite into orbit. The first stage roared to life. Separation was clean. The second stage ignited, pushing the rocket higher, faster. Inside mission control, rows of engineers monitored the numbers. Each console flickered with data. Propellant pressures, guidance corrections, engine burn profiles. Everything was nominal. And then, without warning, the stream froze. Telemetry flatlined. The heartbeat of the rocket stopped mid-digit. Operators switched to radar, expecting to see the metallic body continue its climb. But the screen showed only emptiness. The rocket was gone. Infrared satellites scanned for its heat plume. Nothing. Naval crews in recovery zones listened for the beacon of a splashdown. Silence. A billion-dollar machine had vanished into thin air. The official line was quick and clinical. Vehicle lost due to systems failure. Case closed. But those inside the control room knew differently. They had seen the systems die not one by one, but all at once. Telemetry, radar, infrared, 3 independent networks collapsing in the same second. That shouldn't happen. Not without deliberate cause. And whispers began. Not in the press, but in hallways, in late-night conversations, in the cautious language of people who knew too much. Why did the loss come without debris? Why did every channel of detection blink out simultaneously? Why were sections of the raw data logs later redacted, replaced with black bars and missing timestamps? Some suggested simple malfunction. Others suspected interference. A weapon or system designed to erase a launch from existence. But those who had been in the room spoke of something harder to explain. They described a change in the atmosphere, a heaviness that pressed against the skin, a muffled stillness, as if sound itself had been drained away. One engineer later confessed, "It wasn't like watching a rocket fail. It was like watching it leave for weeks, then months. The case remained silent. No wreckage, no confirmation. Only absence." Until one night, long after the launch was forgotten by the public, a fiery streak slashed across the sky. Tracking stations confirmed it instantly. The object's descent matched the vanished rocket's last known vector almost perfectly. It was as if the machine had finally come home. But as cameras zoomed in, that sense of unease returned. This wasn't the same vehicle. It looked warped, wrong, changed. Something had happened in the space between, And the question was no longer where the rocket had gone. It was what it had become. Rockets do not vanish. Every launch is built on a fortress of data, layers of tracking designed so failure is never ambiguous. If telemetry drops, radar remains. If radar falters, infrared sees the heat. If all else fails, orbital calculations predict the path. The systems are redundant. They are hardened. They are not supposed to fail together. And yet, in this case, every layer blinked out at the same instant. Dozens of sensors beamed back pressure readings, engine thrust curves, guidance corrections. It was the rocket's heartbeat, its nervous system, its lifeline to Earth. At 1736 into the flight, that voice cut off. Mid-digit, midstream, as if someone had pressed mute. Normally, when telemetry fails, radar steps in. Ground-based arrays bounce signals off the vehicle, watching its path. Metal doesn't simply stop reflecting radar. But when operators switched to radar screens, the echo was gone. Not weak, not distorted. Gone. Infrared should have been the final safeguard. Every rocket leaves a blazing plume, a tail of fire detectable hundreds of kilometers away. Infrared satellites orbiting above watch for those signatures constantly. They saw only a flicker, then nothing. 3 independent networks, telemetry, radar, infrared, all collapsing in perfect synchrony. The official explanation was tidy. Telemetry dropout. But telemetry dropout doesn't erase a radar reflection. It doesn't blind orbiting satellites. And it doesn't create a missing block of time in the record. Yet, that is exactly what analysts later found. In the raw radar logs, a jump. 1 second missing. The timeline didn't flow forward, it skipped. Almost as if the event itself had been edited out. Engineers noticed another detail, buried in the background noise. A brief spike just before the loss. A pulse that didn't match any known interference. Not lightning. Not solar flare. Not jamming. Something else. And then, silence. What force could silence a rocket across every detection layer simultaneously? A catastrophic failure. If the rocket had exploded, radar would have shown fragments. Infrared would have recorded a bloom of heat. Instead, both vanished. Interference? A powerful weapon could disrupt systems. But even directed energy leaves scars. Electromagnetic spikes, ionized trails. Here, nothing. Which left only the unspoken possibility that the rocket hadn't failed. It had stepped elsewhere. Some compared it to slipping through a gap in the fabric of physics. A fold in space-time. A corridor where detection itself breaks down. It sounded impossible. And yet, the data pointed in no other direction. One analyst described it this way. Imagine a film reel, frame by frame. Now cut out a single frame. That's what the radar logs looked like, as if reality had skipped. The paranoia grew. If this was an error, why redact so much of the raw data? Why were sensor logs classified almost immediately? Why did engineers who spoke out suddenly fall silent? If it was a failure, it should have been studied openly. Instead, it was buried. And that raised an unsettling thought. What if the rocket hadn't been erased by chance, but by design? Inside Mission Control, silence had a weight. Not the silence of calm, the silence of something missing. The rocket's heartbeat had stopped. The numbers froze, mid-digit. At first, no one moved. Hands hovered over keyboards. Eyes darted from screen to screen, searching for confirmation. But there was none. 1 second, the rocket was there. The next, it wasn't. The first descriptions from those in the room weren't technical. They were visceral. Several engineers reported a sudden heaviness in the air, like a pressure bearing down on their skin, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. One described it as the sensation of walking underwater. Another said it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, not physically, but perceptually. Sound seemed muffled. Breathing felt strange. And then came the most disturbing detail: the sense of time itself skipping. One operator, speaking years later, said this: "Imagine reading a book, and suddenly a whole page is gone. The story jumps forward." That's how it felt. Others described it as a kind of blank space in their memory, a gap, as though they had lived through a moment that simply refused to leave an imprint. For 3 full minutes, the room held its breath. No alarms, no alerts, no static bursts, just absence. And in that absence, unease spread. Some whispered catastrophic failure. Others muttered about jamming. But most said nothing at all, because what they were feeling couldn't be explained in terms of machinery. Years later, a technician who had since retired told an interviewer, "It didn't feel like watching a rocket break apart. It felt like watching it step into a place where we couldn't follow." Another said, with hesitation, "We didn't lose the rocket. We lost contact with reality for a moment. Like it slipped away, and we slipped with it, just for a second." The silence wasn't only unsettling, it was wrong. Every launch, even failures, produces noise. Radio squawks, static bursts, emergency signals. This time, there was nothing. Not even the sound of a system dying. And that absence, the lack of any signal at all, left some convinced the rocket hadn't been destroyed. It had gone somewhere else. Official accounts never included these details: the sensations, the pressure, the gaps in memory. But off the record, many confirmed it. One analyst summarized it simply: "It didn't feel like failure. It felt like departure." When the moment passed, the room seemed to reset. The hum of machines returned, the pressure lifted, sound came back, but the rocket did not. Those who were there carried that moment with them for years. Not just the technical impossibility, not just the lost data, but the sensation, the feeling that something larger had brushed against reality, something they couldn't measure, couldn't record, couldn't prove, only remember. When the data refused to give answers, theories took their place. Some grounded, some speculative, all incomplete. Theory 1: catastrophic failure. The simplest explanation was also the most conventional: a sudden catastrophic failure. Perhaps the rocket's fuel tank ruptured. Perhaps a guidance malfunction sent it into a structural overload. An invisible crack in the body could have widened under stress. Instant disintegration at altitude. Supporters of this theory point to history. Rockets are fragile machines. They have failed before. They will fail again. But even catastrophic failures leave evidence. A debris field spread across the ocean. A flare of heat detectable by satellites. Fragments scattered across tracking zones. Here, there was none. No debris. No flare. No fragments. Not even the noise of systems tearing apart. To believe this theory is to accept an unprecedented kind of failure. One that erased every trace of its own existence. Theory 2: interference. Another explanation reached beyond the rocket itself. What if it wasn't a malfunction? What if it was silenced? Some whispered of deliberate interference, an adversary testing technology, jamming, directed energy strikes, an invisible weapon capable of severing the rocket's ties to Earth. In principle, such interference could explain the simultaneous loss of telemetry, radar, and infrared. But physics is stubborn. Even if communication is jammed, A physical body still reflects radar. Even if systems are fried, heat signatures still bloom. Interference should leave fingerprints, spikes of electromagnetic noise, ionized trails in the upper atmosphere, scars in the data. Here, there were none. The silence was too perfect. Some analysts argued that this perfection was exactly the point. If the weapon was advanced enough, perhaps it was designed not only to destroy but to erase. But if so, one question looms larger than the rest. Who would possess such technology? And why use it here? On this launch, on this night, on this vehicle. Theory 3. Anomalous transit. The most controversial theory was also the most unsettling. What if the rocket did not fail? What if it did not fall? What if it crossed into somewhere else? Proponents call this anomalous transit, a displacement through a region where space, time, or matter behaves differently. Evidence is circumstantial, but suggestive. The missing second in radar logs. The spike of background noise that did not match any known phenomenon. The testimonies from operators describing pressure, silence, a blank space in memory. Each detail points not to destruction, but to transition. Skeptics dismiss it as science fiction, yet the re-entry, months later, complicates the dismissal. If the rocket truly failed, why did something return? And why did that something carry the scars of an altered history? None of these theories is complete. Each explains a piece of the puzzle. None explains the whole. Catastrophic failure accounts for loss, but not for silence. Interference explains silence, but not the absence of electromagnetic scars. Anomalous transit accounts for silence, but stretches the limits of what physics can bear. And so, the question lingers. Not just how the rocket disappeared, but why it returned at all. Because what streaked back across the atmosphere months later looked like the missing rocket, but was not the same. One analyst put it bluntly. The material looked like it had been up there for hundreds of years, but we only launched it months ago. Radiation levels in the samples were equally baffling. The exposure did not match what the rocket should have encountered. It was as if the vehicle had passed through regions of intense, unknown energy. Paint fragments told a stranger story still. Patterns of erosion suggested forces inconsistent with atmospheric re-entry. Scorch marks cut across the surface in ways no re-entry corridor could produce. Even the fasteners, the bolts holding sections together, were subtly warped. Not melted, not fractured. Warped. One metallurgist summarized the findings. It was the right rocket, but not the same rocket. Something had happened to it. 3 possibilities emerged. The first, temporal distortion. That the rocket had somehow experienced time differently. What to us were months, were to it centuries. The second, environmental rewriting. That the rocket had passed through a region of space hostile to matter itself. A zone capable of aging, twisting, or reforging material. The third, intervention. That the rocket had been altered, not by natural forces, but by something else. Official reports called it a partial recovery. They acknowledged anomalies but minimized their significance. No press conference, no display, no further launches of the same design. The object was quietly sealed away in a dark hangar, studied in silence, filed into classified archives, and never spoken of publicly again. But the questions remain. What happened in the gap between launch and return? Where did the rocket go? What forces aged its alloys, altered its shielding, rewrote its very structure? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was the object that came back truly ours? Or was it something else? A reconstruction, a replacement, a message. What we lost wasn't what we found. Because if a rocket can vanish and return changed, what else might space be capable of sending back to us